11 most brutal abortion methods used by medieval queens swallowing liquid metal, crushing their own ribs with leather straps, or letting slimy creatures drain their lifeblood. These were the methods many powerful women in medieval Europe chose to erase an unwanted secret. When safe medical options were virtually non-existent, they gambled their lives in the dark corners of their castles. The line between concealing the truth and self-destruction was unimaginably thin. The following 11 methods expose a dark corner of history. The very first method, in particular, will show you that the most brutal pressure didn't come from any potion or needle, but from what was lurking right outside the door. Number 11. Sharp metal instruments. Step back in time to a late autumn night in 1340. The side door of a Florentine mansion creaks open. A figure, face entirely obscured by a woolen hood, slips inside with stealthy footsteps. Those who arrived were rarely renowned physicians or classically trained clerics. They were freelancers, operating under the guise of barbers or herbalists. In their hands, they clutched a small leather pouch. Once the deed was done, they would leave with a pouch of silver coins and absolutely never set foot in this district again. When the leather pouch was unrolled on a wooden table, it revealed long metal rods, a few bronze hairpins, and thin iron skewers. The concept of bacteria or infection was virtually absent from the minds of those present. No boiling water to sterilize the tools, no alcohol to cleanse them. The metal rod might just be hastily wiped on the hem of an old garment. So the task of this clandestine practitioner was to apply direct physical force from within using the metal tip. The intent was to use a hard object to inflict physical trauma, forcing the body to expel the fetus. To avoid making a sound, the woman on the bed often had to bite down hard on a rolled-up piece of cloth or a scrap of animal hide. The clinking of metal against a bronze tray, the crackling of firewood in the hearth, and rapid, ragged breathing were the only distinct sounds in the sealed room. This intervention carried catastrophic risks. Introducing a rigid, sharp, unsterilized object deep into the body largely led to mechanical trauma in the pelvic region. Just days after that night, the local church death records would occasionally feature new entries citing prolonged high fever or acute intestinal illness. But beneath those words lay the consequences of uncontrollable surface infections. The patient's body reacted with blistering fevers, labored breathing, pallid skin. They collapsed rapidly on their beds, unable even to sit up for a sip of water. When the situation spiraled out of control, families might hastily summon legitimate doctors. The physician would check the pulse and prescribe fever reducers, but silence was the unwritten rule in many powerful households. The traces of physical intervention were meticulously covered up. Entire bedsheets were replaced in the dead of night. Bronze trays were dumped at the bottom of the river, and servants were forbidden to breathe a word to outsiders. And this neat orchestration protected the family's reputation, but at the cost of terrifying health risks and wounds far too easily spotted by a sharp-eyed physician. Recognizing the danger of iron rods, many began seeking less direct methods. They pivoted to therapies carefully camouflaged under the guise of contemporary medical treatments, forcing the body to purge by depleting its circulation. Number 10. Extreme bloodletting and leeches. When the risks of a metal rod became too conspicuous, many noble women turned to a method far easier to disguise. They exploited familiar treatment protocols. Picture a private clinic tucked behind a narrow alley in 15th century Paris. The corridor reeks of sour vinegar and dried herbs. In the corner, a woman leans back in a wooden chair, slowly rolling up her puffy sleeve. Beside her, the healer dips iron tongs into an earthen jar. He extracts live, soaking wet, pitch-black leeches and places them directly onto the pale flesh of the patient's arm and ankle. The sound of leeches latching onto skin and the dripping of fluid into a bronze basin on the floor are the only sounds echoing in the late afternoon. European medicine in this era was heavily influenced by humoral theory. Many medical practitioners believed the human body was governed by various fluids. Pregnancy was sometimes mistaken for, or intentionally misdiagnosed by doctors as, an accumulation of excess humors. The healer could easily tell the husband or family that the young woman was suffering from melancholia and needed her circulation reduced. Under this veneer of medical knowledge, extreme bloodletting was conducted openly in the name of healing. And instead of nourishing the patient, the true goal of these interventions was to drain their physical strength. They repeatedly applied leeches or made tiny incisions on the calves for days on end. Circulation plummeted. The practitioner hoped that when the body weakened to an alarming degree, it would automatically halt the supply of nutrients to prioritize core survival, thereby terminating the pregnancy. The consequences unfolded right before the family's eyes. The patient's face grew bone-dry and ashen. Her heartbeat stuttered. Beads of sweat formed on her forehead despite the bitter cold outside. Instead of strolling in the garden, she could only sit, with her head resting on a pillow. Numerous records from ancient medical texts reveal that many patients fell into a state of lethargy and disorientation, dropping teacups from their hands due to severe dizziness. Bloodletting demanded patience. It took weeks. But for those counting down the days before their gowns could no longer hide an expanding waistline, bloodletting was far too slow. They needed something that acted faster, something that could be downed in a single gulp, administered right at home without calling for a physician. Number 9. Drinking pennyroyal tea. Behind the noisy kitchen of a 16th century English manor, where servants were kneading dough and chopping roasts, a small fire burned against the stone wall. Upon it, a palm-sized clay pot boiled furiously, emitting an acrid, minty scent laced with a pungent, earthy undertone. This was pennyroyal, growing wild along moss-covered fences. It is merely an herbaceous plant with a pleasant, minty aroma. But when crushed, or boiled and concentrated into a dark liquid, it transforms into a potent poison. Women wishing to cover up an incident would secretly dispatch a trusted maid with small change to suburban markets to buy dried pennyroyal leaves. The bundle was smuggled back, hidden beneath an apron. The maid would brew it into a thick tea, strain the liquid, and pour it into a silver goblet to mask its murky color. The drinker had to hold her breath, tilt her head back, and swallow the bitter liquid whole. They were convinced that the strong medicinal properties of the herb would trigger violent muscle contractions in the lower abdomen, thereby expelling the pregnancy within hours. However, human physiology doesn't operate on hearsay. The toxin pulegone present in pennyroyal, once ingested, travels straight to the liver's filtration system. And the boundary between a dose sufficient to cause contractions and a dose that causes fatal organ failure was something no brewer of that era could measure with precision. A handful of leaves too large, a fire too hot. Any of these could alter the outcome entirely. A few hours after consumption, the reaction began. The woman would double over, her hands clutching the bed frame as stomach cramps tore through her. Sweat soaked the back of her gown. Waves of nausea hit relentlessly. At high doses, the toxin halted liver function. Breathing became labored, every inhale accompanied by a choking wheeze. Many collapsed right on the wooden floorboards, gasping for air. In some cases, the body reacted with localized seizures before plunging into respiratory failure. The miracle water, brewed from leaves, did not yield the clean outcome they imagined, but rather plunged the user into a state of toxic shock, ravaging them from the inside out. Furthermore, the concentrated herb tasted intensely bitter and was difficult to swallow. The pungent odor on the breath could also easily arouse suspicion. So, to deceive the palate and completely conceal their actions, what did they do? They turned to a far more dangerous compound, one that could dissolve smoothly into the extravagance of lavish banquets. Number 8. Lead-laced wine and heavy metals. A late afternoon banquet in Florence. Guests are raising their glasses, the clinking of crystal blending with the rhythmic strumming of stringed instruments. At a long table adorned with wax candles and fresh fruit, a noblewoman gently brings a goblet of dark red wine to her lips. The wine glides down her throat, carrying an unusually sweet taste, far smoother than the harsh casks just brought up from the cellar. That sweetness didn't come from pressed grapes or honey. It came from lead acetate, a white powdered compound that the alchemists of the time called by a beautiful name, sugar of lead. Alchemy during this period still deeply intersected with medicine. Among laboratories filled with glass vials and sulfur smoke, scholars whispered that lead and certain heavy metal compounds could arrest fetal development. From those whispers, small paper packets of lead powder began to be traded illicitly, slipping into the diets of women seeking an escape. Unlike the bitter pennyroyal, lead powder, when dissolved in wine, automatically neutralized the wine's acidity and enhanced its sweetness. The red liquid didn't change color or emit a strange odor. The woman could calmly drain her glass right in front of her family members without raising a shred of suspicion. The moment it entered the digestive system, the poisoning process unfolded in absolute silence. The lead seeped through the stomach lining, entered the bloodstream, and began its assault on the central nervous system. No agonizing screams, no immediate convulsions. The destruction occurred at an agonizingly slow, daily pace. A few weeks later, the user would begin dropping keys or embroidery needles as the muscles in her fingers lost their dexterity. Her steps down the hallway became staggered. Gaps appeared in her memory. Sometimes she would stare blankly, unable to recall what she had said just minutes prior. Her gums grew inflamed and red, and a faint blue-gray line appeared along the base of her teeth, the hallmark sign of severe lead poisoning. Whether the pregnancy was affected remained a cruel game of chance. But the cognitive decline in the mother was undeniably visible. They would often sit huddled in an armchair, their dull eyes fixed on a candle, motor functions failing. The toxic metal had accomplished its task in a twisted way, permanently damaging an adult's neurological structure merely to resolve a temporary dilemma. But when ingested substances reacted too slowly and the changing silhouette began to directly threaten personal honor, they were forced to resort to physical force. This time, not with a sharp metal tip from the inside, but through immense pressure from the outside. Number 7. Binding the abdomen with stiff cloth and leather. In a cramped dressing room in 16th century Madrid, a maid is bracing herself, leaning one knee heavily against the back of a wooden chair for leverage. Her hands viciously pull a multi-layered band of cloth, combined with leather straps, tightly wrapping around her mistress's waist. The harder she pulls, the tighter the woman's hands grip the edge of the dressing table, her eyebrows knitted in agony from the pressure. Long before steel-boned corsets became the fashion standard, abdominal binding was applied as a blunt physical measure. The intent here was stark: to use immense external mechanical constriction to force the internal organs together, stripping away all the space in the pelvic cavity, and forcing internal development to a standstill. For this method to wield its power, the wearer couldn't just endure it for a few hours at a banquet. They had to wear the sweat-soaked binding continuously, day and night. The crushing weight on the lower ribs made a deep breath impossible. They could only take short, shallow, rapid breaths, their chests barely rising. The consequence of this brutal compression left physical marks on the flesh. Under the relentless pressure of the leather, peripheral blood vessels burst, leaving patches of dark black bruises wrapping around the ribs. Circulation to the lower body was severely hampered, causing the legs to constantly go numb. In many cases, the lower rib cage was squeezed out of shape, stabbing into the liver and stomach region, causing incessant acid reflux. The cruel irony of this method was that it often wore down the mother's strength long before reaching its goal. Even if the woman suffered chest pains so severe she fainted while kneeling in prayer at church, in many cases, the life within remained stubbornly resilient, pushing back against the force of the leather straps. When physical force from the outside failed to solve the problem and only yielded bruises that were hard to hide, people turned to other methods. This time, they chose a heavy metal that could spill across the palm of a hand. Number 6. Swallowing quicksilver, mercury. In many medieval European cities, mercury wasn't exceptionally difficult to find. Goldsmiths used it for gilding, and physicians sometimes carried it in their wooden medicine chests as a drastic measure for difficult cases. Through a somewhat naive physical logic of the time, rumors spread that the sinking nature and massive weight of mercury would create a gravitational pull, dragging all bodily obstructions out with it. The woman had to hold the glass vial herself, uncap it, and tip the liquid metal down her throat. Mercury didn't taste bitter or sour, but it possessed a slick, freezing, and heavy sensation as it slid straight into the stomach. They gritted their teeth and swallowed, clinging to the hope that it would clear away all their troubles in a few short hours, leaving no open wounds and making no noise to draw attention. But the moment it permeated the intestinal wall and entered the bloodstream, the mercury's toxicity began mapping out a path of widespread devastation. Just a few days later, instead of the desired result, and the symptoms of heavy metal poisoning emerged. The woman's hair began to fall out in large clumps, sticking to her horn comb or scattering across her feather pillow. Paralysis crept from the tips of her fingers and toes, traveling up the major muscle groups. Holding a silver soup spoon or reaching up to button a dress became an insurmountable challenge. Worse still, mercury directly attacked the central nervous system. Uncontrollable shivers racked their bodies, even as they stood beside a roaring fireplace. Their jaws trembled uncontrollably, teeth chattering together to produce a faint, haunting, clicking sound. Physicians summoned at this stage could mostly only stand by and watch, as there were virtually no effective heavy metal detox protocols in that era. Instead of the swift solution promised by rumors, the user's body deteriorated at a terrifying pace. This neurological damage was often irreversible. It turned a healthy individual into a cripple, gasping for breath on a bed, with fading vision and contorted limbs. When expensive chemicals or internal remedies left such glaring aftermaths, many women were forced to revert to the most primitive method. A method that required no money, no assisting maids, but demanded agonizing physical torment day after day. Number 5. Starving to exhaustion. Retreating to a prayer room for purification was a perfectly reasonable excuse among the ancient nobility. Claiming the need for a private space to pray, they locked themselves away. Usually, no servant dared to intrude upon this personal religious sanctuary, and the moment the wooden latch clicked into place, and they began a process of self-banishment. Absolute starvation. Regularly, twice a day, a servant would leave a food tray at the threshold. It might hold a loaf of baked barley bread, a bowl of meat stew, or a jug of freshly milked cow's milk. But hours later, when the servant returned for the tray, everything remained untouched. The layer of fat on the soup had congealed. Not a single piece of bread had been broken. The intent behind fasting was crystal clear. Cut off the nutritional supply entirely, forcing the body into a state of survival alarm. When no energy was taken in, the body would begin to drain its fat reserves, then cannibalize muscle tissue. They believed that when pushed to the absolute brink of exhaustion, the body's self-defense mechanism would trigger, and automatically aborting the pregnancy to preserve the mother's core life. In reality, by the third day, the body's reaction was violent. The stomach spasmed relentlessly, secreting acidic gastric juices that burned the chest. By the second week, lips were cracked and bleeding, cheeks were hollowed out, and the skin clung tightly to the jawbone. The woman could only lie curled up on the cold stone floor, her heartbeat slowing and growing faint. Dizzy spells that blacked out her vision crashed over her every time she tried to push herself up to sit. However, the line between terminating a pregnancy and starving oneself to death was incredibly difficult to control. In many cases, the ravages of severe malnutrition destroyed the body faster than anticipated. Records from local churches show that occasionally, a woman would be found entirely unconscious, slumped over her wooden prayer kneeler. They passed away from sheer exhaustion before their bodies could mount any rejection response. The wait through starvation eroded both physical strength and sanity. But sometimes, physiological progression didn't allow them the time to slowly starve. They needed a sudden accident, one that happened in front of witnesses to legitimize the facade of the story. Number 4. Intentional self-harm. Marble staircases in castles were often steep and rarely carpeted in unpopulated areas. One morning, as servants were scrubbing the great hall, they suddenly heard a blood-curdling scream. This was immediately followed by the hollow, sickening thud of a body tumbling down the jagged stone steps. Their mistress lay crumpled at the foot of the stairs, her arms clutching her abdomen, face contorted in agony. Bystanders rushed over to help her up amid panicked whispers. Most of the time, this was no mere misstep. It was a fall whose trajectory had been aimed and meticulously calculated. When starvation proved too time-consuming and sharp metal rods carried a high risk of infection, inflicting severe physical trauma was the most direct way to extinguish suspicion. A dive down the stairs, a purposeful slip slamming the abdomen against the edge of an oak chest, or using a heavy object to strike oneself repeatedly while alone in the bedchamber. All of it was cleverly orchestrated to look like a cruel twist of fate. The woman gambled that the immense force of mechanical impact would create a shockwave massive enough to break the internal connection and end the ordeal. If the plan worked, they could blame it all on the fall. There would be no prying eyes, no rumors spreading at banquets. Society at the time would merely view the event as a tragic, accidental loss. But the human body is not a machine you can simply smash in the exact spot you want. Throwing oneself down a staircase or intentionally crashing into objects carried the risk of massive internal organ rupture. Instead of cleanly achieving their goal, many faced catastrophic internal hemorrhaging. The impact could fracture ribs, driving bone splinters into the pleural cavity. Internal structural damage often left massive scarring, stripping away the ability to bear children in future politically aligned marriages. Furthermore, massive, pooling bruises were easily deciphered by experienced physicians. Recognizing this risk, many women sought another method of physical intervention, one that left no scratches on the skin, but slowly drained their life force in a confined, steam-filled space. Number 3. Extreme steaming and boiling baths. In many grand estates, heat was often used as a therapy to soothe muscles after long hunting trips. But when backed into a corner, temperature was twisted into an instrument of physiological coercion. Picture a small sauna sealed with pine wood, or a deep copper bathtub filled with water heated well beyond normal tolerance levels. The air is thick with steam. Visibility is reduced to a murky few inches. The woman submerged herself in it or sat hugging her knees on a wooden bench, letting the sweat pour out and mat her hair. Modern audiences view saunas as a way to relieve stress, but for these women, and it was a test of the cardiovascular system's absolute limits, they exploited prolonged heat to force their core body temperature to spike, intentionally inducing an artificial fever. The goal was to use an extreme environment to disrupt all internal bodily processes. The crackle of firewood from the furnace outside and the sound of labored panting inside blended together. The heart beat rapidly, hammering against the rib cage. In the dense, steamy space, simply breathing in and out became suffocating. The trachea burned dry. Many ancient medical records have documented cases where servants frantically discovered their mistress passed out inside the steam room. The body lost water too rapidly through the sweat glands, leading to a catastrophic drop in blood pressure. Sometimes, a heat stroke completely obliterated their consciousness before anyone could open the door. They collapsed onto the wet floor, leaving a lingering silence between four blistering walls. But sitting still and enduring steam was still a passive act. Many chose a more proactive, more brutal method. They stepped beyond the castle walls, embarking on an agonizing journey over uneven, rocky roads. Number 2. Horseback riding to exhaustion. A retinue set out before the sun had even crested the horizon. The excuse provided was usually perfectly reasonable to deceive those left behind. A trip to visit distant relatives in another fiefdom, or a pilgrimage to a secluded monastery on a hill. But the true destination wasn't a place. It was the grueling journey itself. The woman was helped into the saddle. The route chosen by the guide was largely comprised of the bumpiest, rockiest paths, tangled with roots and riddled with as many potholes as possible. Unlike plush, padded seats, saddles of the era were unforgivingly hard. The jolting was relentless, synchronized with every heavy strike of the horse's hooves against the dirt road. The weight of her body continuously slammed down onto the stamped leather saddle, hour after hour. The shock wave shot straight up her spine and pelvis. Her hands had to grip the reins tightly to maintain balance, until her knuckles turned white and her arms went numb with fatigue. They firmly believed that high-intensity shaking, combined with repetitive impact, would force the body to surrender the life growing within. Just put yourself in that scenario, and you will see how profoundly this physical torture eroded a human being. No suspension systems, no cushioning. Just body weight repeatedly colliding with leather and a wooden frame. Such journeys could last for agonizing days, wading through shallow streams and only stopping at squalid roadside way stations to water the horses. The energy drain was etched into their faces. The further they rode, the more rapid and desperate their breathing became. Eyes grew glazed from exhaustion and pain. In more than a few cases, the rider swayed in the saddle and collapsed, sliding straight down onto the gravel path, completely drained. Their bodies gave out entirely long before the fake journey ever reached its destination. By this stage, and when methods ranging from mechanical physics to heavy chemicals proved utterly useless or left unsalvageable consequences, what was left to cling to? The answer brings us to the most dangerous frontier of society at the time, where the terror of pregnancy collided head-on with the terror of the burning stake. Number 1. Forbidden rituals and juniper smoke. In this final method, there is no shadow of sharp metal blades, no boiling tubs, no jolting saddles. When they lacked the coin to bribe a tight-lipped physician, or were paralyzed by the fear of being exposed by prying servants, many women turned to underground folk beliefs. In hidden rooms deep within wine cellars, or in dilapidated huts on the edge of the woods, clandestine acts began. History often records these gatherings with extreme caution. They used dried animal remains, lit dull black wax candles in dark corners, or tossed sprigs of juniper bushes into glowing braziers. Juniper is a very distinct plant. When set ablaze, it emits an earthy, acrid smoke, laced with a lingering scent of pine resin. Whispers circulated that the smoke of this plant carried a purifying power, capable of chasing unwanted life from the body. The woman had to sit hunched closely over the brazier, inhaling the blinding smoke until she choked and coughed violently, muttering incomprehensible words, gambling her fate on an invisible force. Scientifically speaking, inhaling juniper smoke cannot alter the physical structure of the pelvis. But the psychological pressure of this act saturated every corner of the room. To comprehend this recklessness, and you must place yourself in the social context of Europe at that time. Any individual practicing rituals unsanctioned by the Church ran the immediate risk of being charged directly with witchcraft and heresy. This was a gamble with life itself. All it took was the pungent scent of a juniper branch seeping through a wooden crack and wafting down the hallway. All it took was a passing servant accidentally witnessing a strange behavior. The woman could easily find herself standing before the Inquisition. The punishment for this crime was almost always carried out in front of a mob, and it was unimaginably barbaric. The desperate desire to hide a personal dilemma, driven by the fear of losing property or status, ultimately pushed them to step into a criminal act vastly more dangerous than any biological barrier. Yet the suffocating despair meant they would rather face the risk of being hunted by a rabid mob than expose the truth of their growing belly. We have just traversed 11 methods that European women of the past utilized to resolve unwanted pregnancies. From thin iron rods and blood-sucking leeches to lead-laced wine and blinding herbal smoke. They did not act out of innate cruelty. They acted because they had run out of options. When societal dictates bore down heavily upon their shoulders, and medicine was nothing more than misguided protocols, their own bodies became the battlegrounds that bore the consequences. Among these 11 methods, which detail left you with the deepest chills? Was it the physical crushing of a leather strap, cinching the waist? Or the silent devastation of lead poison weaving through the veins? Leave your perspective right down below in the comments section. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button as we continue to uncover the most harrowing truths of history. See you in the next video.